And if there's anyone who still can't, if you can please just let me know via the chat box. I think we've sorted out whatever kinks there were. Okay, you should all see a blank blue screen. And the PowerPoint should be going through now. And you should have the PowerPoint up now.
Looking good.
Okay. I think we're sorted. Okay, do we have the UDF source now? Oh, no.
Yeah, yes, you do.
Oh, they're saying no.
That's strange. I can see it on my screen. Source-based applications, we can do it.
Okay, and now the UDF source.
Not yet. It still says source-based application.
I'm on the UDF source now.
There's a little lady jumping up a flight of stairs saying we can do it.
I'm already on the next one. Do you think there's a delay?
There might be. Let's give it a few seconds.
Okay. Still on the we can do it.
Unfortunately, yes. And what do you see on your screen? You see a UDF.
I'm on the UDF source.
Do me a favor and close that PowerPoint again. Let's see if that changes so we can add a problem. Yeah, that changes immediately. So there's UDF. Now we've got UDF on the screen. Yes. Reason for the UDF's formation.
Yes.
Yes, that's where we are.
Do they know? The source below highlights the role the UDF played.
Well, here it says reason for the UDF's formation. Why, according to the source, was the UDF formed? That's what we're looking at the moment.
So it's just not picking up this particular...
Yeah, so there's something with that. It's not your stream. It's your PowerPoint is not jumping.
I can see the settings of it. It's jumping past that particular source. No luck now?
Well, we don't see PowerPoint. We see the content telematics PowerPoint. We see that, but it's not full screen. So it depends on you, what you want to show on the screen.
No, I'm on the PowerPoint.
Yes, it says the source below highlights the role of the UDF played in challenging the apartheid regime in 1980. It's just not full screen.
It is full screen by me.
It hasn't jumped to full screen on our side. Maybe just don't make it slide presentation and just try and make it as big as you can without going into a slide. That is so strange. On my YouTube stream, I see the full screen, but here I don't see the full screen.
Can we see that? Do we see it now?
Asiboni.
Grant, do you see it now at all? I'm not in full screen.
It's still clutter on my side, unfortunately. Try and minimize that.
Now?
Still, there we go, that looks better. And then try and make it full screen again. No, I don't know why it is.
I'll just do the slide from here and then go back to presentation.
100%.
Okay, can everyone see this? I know it's a minimized view, but I will read it out to you if everybody can just see that particular screen.
They can.
Okay, awesome. Alright, so the source below highlights the role the UDF played in challenging the apartheid regime in the 1980s. So steps towards, it's 5 sentences, I'm going to read it out. No, my darling, it's not almost tea time. Tea time is at 10:45. Okay, so steps towards forming the UDF began in the late 1970s and moved forward when Alan Busak called for a united front of churches, civic associations, trade unions, student organizations, and sports bodies to fight oppression. Yes, Mr. Boxer, I understand Grant cannot sort it out. I don't know what's wrong with the slide, hence the reason that I'm reading it out. It's just this particular slide, and then we will go back to presentation view. Okay. A committee was formed to look into the possibility of such a front, and it was decided to join with organizations on a regional structure as long as they were non-racist. In May 1983, the Natal UDF was launched, followed by the Transvaal and Western Cape. An interim national committee was formed with members from each region, and a planning meeting was held that was also attended by Albertina Sisulu and Steve Chwete. The committee decided to launch the UDF on the 20th of August 1983, just as the government was scheduled to introduce the tricameral legislation. They decided on a logo and a slogan, UDF Unites, Apartheid Divides, and decided on the principles of the UDF. So delegates of 565 organizations attended the launch, and the immediate reason stated for the formation of the UDF, and this is important, the reason stated for the formation of the UDF was to fight the introduction of the tricameral parliament. However, the formation was actually the result of changes that had been taking place on a social, economic, and political level since the Soweto Uprising. A more militant culture had emerged that led to the formation of many civic, youth, student, worker, women, and other organizations. And there was also increased support for ideas embodied in the Freedom Charter, and there was a strong move towards mass organization. The UDF were very successful in their initial campaign against the tricameral parliament, and voter turnout at the elections was very low. The UDF was, however, still experiencing organizational problems, and it also had competition from some other groups and from affiliates which thought it had too much power. The actions of the 1980s were in many ways just the outcome of so many years of oppression and dissatisfaction. The ANC was also able to infiltrate South Africa more easily and become better organized inside the country during the 1980s. It called for the masses to make South Africa ungovernable so that the National Party would be forced to end apartheid. The UDF took up this call together with many affiliates and the masses. Okay. So, we are going to be looking at how to answer a level 1 source-based question. Okay? A question that requires you to extract information from the source in order to answer the question. So, the question here is why, according to the source, was the UDF formed? Okay? So you need to extract evidence directly from the source or even quote from the source as your response. Okay? So from the source, because it asks why according to the source, not why according to you. Why according to the source? It was to fight the introduction of the tricameral parliament. That is directly lifted from the source. Okay? And this is a common mistake that people make. Is that they paraphrase from the source, they interpret it, and they use their own knowledge and add to it. Okay? The extract is too long. Alright? So why according to the source was the UDF formed? Directly from the source, extracting to fight the introduction of the tricameral parliament. Okay? It is very different when the question asks you in your own words, explain why the UDF was formed. If you could just keep your mics off, please, because we can hear you, and if you could keep the chat to work-related things, please. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about level 1 questions? Okay, so these are your most basic questions. They will come directly from sources. They will ask you for direct information from the sources. They won't require you to interpret anything. Okay, all of you should be able to achieve the maximum amount of marks for your level 1 questions. Don't overthink them. And that's another mistake that people make, is that they overthink the level 1 questions. Okay. Now, a level 2 question, okay, requires you to explain something from the source, to interpret from the source, okay. In this case, explain the slogan, UDF unites, apartheid divides. Now look at the Mark allocation, okay. The Mark allocation is 2 times 2. This means that you are required to give 2 detailed responses, okay. 2 points that for 2 marks, okay. If it's 2 times 1, it's 2 simple extraction, and that's usually level 1 question. But when you have 2 times 2, that's an explanatory question, an interpretive question, that is your level 2 question, okay. So explain with detail or explain fully. Now in this case, it's asking you to explain the slogan, UDF unites, apartheid divides. In that slogan, there are 2 things. You need to explain what does UDF unites mean, and you also need to explain what does apartheid divides mean. So in this case, we're explaining that the UDF united South Africans from all walks of life, irrespective of class, race, gender, or religious beliefs. And we also need to explain the second part, apartheid divides. The apartheid government segregated South Africans along racial lines in political, economic, and social spheres in accordance with its policy of divide and conquer. Okay? Or another relevant response or a relevant interpretation. Okay? But when you have 2 times 2, it means that you must give 2 detailed responses to the question, not 1. And oftentimes what people do is they're giving only half the answer. And so at the end of the day, you are only scoring half the marks. Okay. Comment on the effect of the Soweto Uprising. Comment on the effect the Soweto Uprising had on the formation of the UDF. Okay. Here again, you are required to give 2 detailed responses. You look at your Mark allocation, 2 times 2. Okay. So this question, when you see the words comment on, another way of phrasing that question is explain the effect of the Soweto Uprising. Okay? Or explain the effect the Soweto Uprising had on the formation of the UDF. Okay? So in this case, after the Soweto Uprising, a more militant culture developed. Okay? Because in the source it said that it led to the formation of many civic, youth, student, worker, and other organizations. And the UDF then came about because there was a strong move towards forming a united front as a mass organization. So it incorporated all of those different movements. It brought them together to help organize the protests better. Okay? So you need to look at what the Soweto Uprising, what the impact or result of the Soweto Uprising was. Okay? Which in the source it explained about the militant culture and it explained about the various organizations that emerged, resistance organizations that emerged after the Soweto Uprising. And you need to look at how those resulted in the formation of the UDF. Okay. Use the source and your own knowledge to explain how the UDF contributed to the ANC's call to make South Africa ungovernable. Again, a 2 by 2 question, which means that you once again need to give 2 detailed responses. Okay? One of those responses is going to come from the source and one from your own knowledge. Why? Because the instruction in the question says use the source and your own knowledge. Okay? So from the source, we can draw that the UDF organized and coordinated boycotts, strikes, and stayaways. From my own knowledge, I am drawing that these boycotts, strikes, and stayaways disrupted the rule of law, okay, especially in the townships, and negatively impacted the economy. Okay, so it disrupted the economy in South Africa as a result. Okay, so now we are going to go and we're going to have a look at the booklet that each of you were given. Okay, so you were all issued with your winter school booklet. looking now at the various question levels and the skills that we need in order to answer those questions. Okay. So, in your question paper, you are going to get source-based questions up to the value of 50 marks. Your level 1 questions, those are your simple extraction questions. The ones that are going to require you to just simply take information directly from the source, not interpreting it or anything like that, simply extracting the information from the source or defining certain simple concepts, okay, provide a definition for. Your paper, there's going to be 14 marks that's going to be level 1 questions. Your level 2 questions, which are mainly your extract and interpret questions, are going to be worth 20 marks. And your level 3 questions, which are your more complicated questions, extract, analyze, compare, are going to be 16 marks. Okay. And we are going to focus mostly on the level 1 and level 2 questions, though I will later on, if we have time, touch on and help you to be able to answer the level 3 question, specifically the compare question. Okay. So, the source-based question, okay. Here we go. Okay, in paper 2, your source-based questions are going to focus on the crisis of apartheid, internal resistance, the government's attempts to reform apartheid. It's going to be looking at the Urban Bantu Authorities Act and the tricameral system. And you're not only looking at the content of that, but remember, impact, result. Okay? The internal resistance to the reforms, the growing power of the trade unions, and what were the responses to Botha's reforms, his total strategy, the tricameral parliament. Okay? The new methods of mobilization. So, for example, the Labour's rolling mass action, the role of the civic organizations, the role of the UDF, the role of the MDM, the ECC and the Black Sash, and the support for anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the frontline states. The other source-based question in this paper is going to be on the TRC, okay, which we're not going to cover, and then the end of the Cold War globalization will be the other question that we'll be looking at over there. Okay. Now, this is what we are going to focus on. Okay. So, your level 1 questions are the questions that's going to require you to extract information from the sources. So, it's going to ask you a basic question. What according to the source? Who according to the source? Where according to the source? Why according to the source? Okay? Or it's going to ask you to explain historical concepts and terms. Okay? So, for example, what was the tricameral parliament? Okay? And providing a basic explanation of that. So they will always carry a maximum of 2 marks. Okay? Now, it will be, for example, a 1 times 2. However, you can get questions that will ask you that will be worth 1 mark each. If you're required to give, for example, identify the 3 factors, then it will be 3 times 1. Okay? So it will ask you to list, okay? List the 3 factors. It will ask you to quote directly from the source. It will ask you to identify, okay, who was involved. It will ask you to name, okay, who was the leader, what was the name. It will ask you what the information in the source tells you about. So what according to the source, who according to the source, where according to the source, why according to the source. Quote 4 reasons why, okay. So, yes, it can be, for example, a maximum total of 4 marks, but it will be 4 times 1. Simple answers, extraction answers, okay? And when you are required to give the explanation of historical terms, define the concept of, what you understand by the term, provide a definition for, okay? Your level 2 questions, your interpretation of evidence from sources, explain information that's gathered from the sources, and analyze evidence from the sources. So those questions will carry a maximum of 4 marks, so that's often your 2 times 2 questions. It can also be a 1 times 2, if they will ask you to explain why, and then explain one reason why, okay? So explain, comment, describe, and organize information logically from the sources. So typical questions may be phrased, for example, what message does the cartoonist convey about? And explain in your own words, or why do you think that? Okay, so we'll just see if there is anybody who has any questions at this time. Then we have your level 3 questions, which requires you to interpret and evaluate evidence from sources. It requires you to engage with sources to determine how useful, reliable, biased, and limited sources are. It asks you to compare and contrast interpretations and perspectives presented in sources, and to draw independent conclusions. So, for example, explain to what extent the evidence in source 1A does what? Compare the evidence in sources 2A and 2B. Comment on the usefulness of this source. Why is this source limited? How reliable is this source? Explain the bias in, or explain in which way this source is biased against. Okay, so in working with sources, we need to do the following. The key question provides the focus of content in the sources, and it will also be asked as the paragraph question. So the key question at the beginning of your examination tells you what the focus of all of those questions is going to be. And it is also the question for your paragraph question at the end, the 8-mark question. Okay. Your sources will be labeled, okay, source 1A, 1B, 1C, and your sources will always be contextualized. There will always be a little explanation telling you what the source is about, telling you why it was written, who made it, when it was written, and where the event took place, okay? You need to read the source with understanding, and I often advise when you are reading your source, read with a highlighter and a pencil. Highlight the important words, phrases, concepts, okay? Underline, make notes on the source for yourself, okay? When you are reading, if there's something you don't quite understand, underline, indicate with a pencil, and then read it within the context of the paragraph so that you can understand it better. The Mark Allocation will indicate to you how much information you are required to provide for your response, okay? You can get 1 times 1, which can be a simple 1 word, 1 sentence, 1 phrase answer. 1 times 2, which will require you to quote or write a little bit more. 2 times 1, 2 simple, short answers. 2 times 2, which will be explain in depth, in detail, etc. So, okay, before we get into those, okay, so some guidelines for your source-based questions. So always answer your questions in full sentences, and that will help you avoid being penalized or losing unnecessary marks because your answers are too vague. Okay, you always want to be very, very specific in your answers. Okay, so level 1 source-based questions require basic extraction of evidence from the source. Okay, so very much like your English comprehensions, right, or your Afrikaans comprehensions. So the normal mark allocations for level 1 questions are 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 3 times 1, 4 times 1. Sometimes, not often, sometimes 1 times 2, okay? But you will never get a 2 times 2 for a level 1 question, okay? So an example of a level 1 question, when you're looking at a cartoon, for example, is who is the man shown in the cartoon? And that would be a 1 times 1, okay? And a good answer for such a question would be the man in the cartoon. If we're thinking of the Russian Revolution, the man in the cartoon is Joseph Stalin. Okay? Yes, you can simply answer with Joseph Stalin. Alright? But sometimes we try to avoid being too vague. Sometimes we want to ensure that we're not going to miss out on anything. So try as far as possible to answer your questions in full sentences. Okay? So your level 1 questions are also, as I said before, they are also your questions that require you to provide basic definitions of concepts, okay? Also, again, answer in full sentences. Your level 2 questions require you to interpret information. So you are required to provide a straightforward interpretation of information that can be found in the source, okay? Not a complex interpretation. So that's for level 3. So use the text and your own knowledge. This is just an example. Explain why X broke away from Y, okay? So an example would be X broke away from Y because, okay? Another reason X broke away from Y is because. So that would be for 4 marks because I'm giving from the source, okay? The PAC broke away from the ANC because, okay? Another reason why they broke away is because. So for giving the information or the interpretation from the source, I'm going to get 2 marks. And to get a further 2 marks, I'm going to explain from my own knowledge. Because what is the question? Part of the question, there was also an instruction. And the instruction part of the question told me to use the text and my own knowledge. Okay? Sometimes you can get a question that says simply, using the source, explain why X broke away from Y. And it will still be 2 times 2. That then means that there are 2 reasons within the source why X broke away from Y. And I need to explain both of those reasons. And often what happens is that learners only explain one of the 2 reasons. And they then only get 2 out of the 4 marks. So to ensure that you have achieved the maximum amount of marks that you can get for that question, make sure that you have read the instruction for the question, which is either going to ask you to use the source only or to use the source and your own knowledge, and make sure that you answer exactly what it is asking of you. So if it asks you to use the source and your own knowledge, that then means that there must be, and it's 2 times 2, 2 pieces of information. 1 from the source that you're going to explain and 1 from your own knowledge. If it asks you to limit your answers to information from the source, but it still has a 2 times 2 mark allocation, make sure that you are giving 2 different explanations, 2 different points that you are expanding on. Okay? You can't go and write 6 sentences on 1 point. You're still only going to get 2 marks. To get the 4 marks, you must have 2 different points. Level 2 questions are also for certain definitions, okay? So you will be asked to provide explanations of terms and concepts that have been covered in the section. So, for example, if we were doing World War II, describe the meaning of anti-Semitism. Okay, so not what is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the prejudice against Jews, for example. So kind of explain the meaning of anti-Semitism. So it's a term used to describe the prejudice or feeling of hostility towards Jewish people, and then you can put it within context, okay? Sometimes within the context of the time, okay? So an example of a vague answer over there, and this is the reason why you must answer in full sentences. So a vague answer would be dislike of Jews, okay? That doesn't explain to me what anti-Semitism is, because anti-Semitism involves prejudice, it involves discrimination, and it involved hostility against Jewish people, not just simply a dislike of Jews, okay? And in that case, when you are just saying dislike of Jews, you're not going to get any marks. Hence the reason that we answer in full sentences and that we give as detailed an answer as possible, okay? Especially when the questions are asking, are your level 2 and your level 3 questions. Okay. Now, your level 3 questions, there are 3 main types that you are going to be looking at. Okay, or 2 main types that you're going to be looking at. So, the first of those is going to be evaluating the usefulness of sources, okay? So, source-based questions, they usually include a question that requires the learners to establish the usefulness of a source, okay? So, how useful is the source, okay? Or why would source A be useful? So, answering those questions, that typically includes identifying whether the source is a primary or a secondary source, and whether the information in the source can be trusted, relates to the topic, or if it contains any bias. So an example of that, of a level 3 question of evaluating a usefulness or value, okay, how valuable or how useful is the source. So an example of this is, why would source A be useful to a historian studying anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany? Okay? Or how valuable is source A to historians studying anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany? So, an example, and that would always be a 2 times 2 question. Something like that would always be a 2 times 2 question. Okay? So, you need to look at what are the elements in that source that make it useful to me. Okay? So, the source is useful because maybe it was written in Germany in 1939 at the time, which therefore makes it a primary source. Okay? That's going to give me 2 marks already, because I've identified that, not that it is a primary source, but why it's a primary source. Okay? We can't just go and write it's a primary source. Explain to the examiner why it is a primary source. Then find another reason why the source is useful, and this is where learners are always falling short with these level 3 questions, is that we are always only giving half of the information. It is 2 times 2, which means you must have 2 responses, 2 detailed responses. Okay? So the source might also be useful because it might provide specific information about Nazi propaganda. It might provide specific information about why Jews were targeted, etc., etc. Okay? So the first is identifying that you might get, if we look at the opposite of this question, is why is the source limited? Okay? You might be saying then that the source is a primary source. Okay? However, it's limited in that it is biased against a certain group of people, or it is biased in favor of a certain group of people. Okay? So that's kind of the opposite, evaluating the limitations of the source. Okay? Explain the bias in the source. And always these questions are going to be for 4 marks, which means that you must give 2 detailed responses, not just 1. Don't go on for 6 or 8 lines explaining the 1 point, okay? When you need to be explaining 2 different points. Now the level 3 questions that learners often struggle with are the comparison questions, okay? So comparing 2 different sources, alright? So those questions will always have a 2 by 2 mark allocation, okay? And where learners fall short is that they are always only giving 1 set of comparative information when they should be giving 2 sets of comparative information. So an example of a question here would be, explain how the information in source 1D provides evidence to support the views expressed in 1C regarding the Soweto Uprising. Okay? So explain how the information in source 1D supports the views in source 1C. Okay? Now what learners will often do is the right thing. They'll say source 1D says this, and it is supported by source 1C which says this, and then they're done. That is the mistake that you are making. Okay? You are not getting 2 marks for giving the information from 1D and then 2 marks for giving the information from 1C. You are being given 2 marks per comparison, which means essentially there must be 4 pieces of information in there. Okay? 2 of them must be one comparison and 2 of them must be another different comparison. So your answer must say, source 1D says this, which is supported by source 1C which says that. That is going to give you 2 marks. You must have then another different comparison which again says, source 1D then also says this, which is supported by source 1C which says that. Again, the problem, the biggest mistake that learners make in this particular level 3 question is that they are only giving 1 comparison. And because they are only giving 1 comparison, they are only getting half the marks. This question is asking you to provide 2 different comparisons. So when you see a source that asks you to explain how the information from one source supports another source, or the opposite of that, how it is contradicted by the other source, how they differ. So looking at how they are the same and how they differ. And it gives you a 2 times 2 mark allocation. Remember that you must give not just 2 pieces of information, you need to give 2 different points of comparison. Source 1D and 1C says this, and source 1D and 1C says that. 2 different comparisons, okay? So that's just the important thing that I wanted to bring across to you with regard to the level 3 questions, because that is the main area where learners are losing marks with level 3 questions or not achieving any marks with level 3 questions, is because they are only giving half the answer. Okay. So, here in your booklet, and we go back to the booklet now, is the following source describes the reforms carried out by TPW Botha in the hope that they appease the black majority in South Africa and the world. Okay? So the South African government, led by P.W. Botha, introduced changes which it claimed were reforms. These, it was hoped, would reduce international criticism of apartheid, satisfy white South Africans, form relations with other black countries in Africa, and reduce internal black resistance. The 1982 Black Local Authorities Act created elected community councils in the hope that some control over local affairs would satisfy their political aspirations and they would not demand democratic rights at national level. The strategy was to admit a small and carefully chosen and controlled number of blacks into the middle class. The thinking was that by creating a richer black middle class who would support apartheid and the government because they now needed apartheid to keep their elevated positions, and black resistance would be reduced. The government also tried to make the gap between Indian, coloured and African more defined, and this was done through a new constitution that the National Party government introduced in 1983. The constitution created a new parliamentary system called the tricameral parliament. Many people saw these reforms as merely cosmetic, as though they changed the face of apartheid from the outside. And the system did not really change at all, and the situation for the normal man on the street got worse rather than better. As we mentioned earlier, the tricameral system, the tricameral parliament, was a facade of change. It made it look on the outside like there was change, but it gave people of color no real power. Okay? The apartheid, the white government still controlled all of the important aspects which governed any bit of power. Okay, source 1b, the UDF and its opposition to Botha's reforms. So the UDF's opposition to P.W. Botha's reforms manifested itself in several actions. Shortly after its formation, it launched a successful boycott action against the Coloured House of Representatives and Indian House of Delegates. The UDF was involved in the organization of several consumer boycotts and stayaways. In 1983 and 1984, it launched the 1 million signatures campaign, in which the signatories were asked to voice their opposition to the so-called Koornhof legislation on black local government, as well as the new constitution. However, the UDF's greatest impact was at grassroots level, where it created local structures that played a key role in political education and mobilization of the masses. At its second National Congress, held in April 1985, it was decided to transform mass support into active participation under the theme "From Protest to Challenge, from Mobilization to Organization." 4 months later, the theme was extended to include a new slogan, "Forward to People's Power." The state headed off this threat and suppressed the general unrest in the country, which peaked in 1985 by calling a series of states of emergency. Many people were arrested in terms of the security regulations. The UDF was badly affected. Several key members of the organization were murdered, including Matthew Gonewe, which was the UDF organizer in the Eastern Cape, and Victoria Mtsenge, the UDF treasurer in Natal. Okay. The statement released by Reverend Alan Bussack at a special meeting of the Executive Committee Against Apartheid on July 24, 1985. I cannot begin to describe what has been happening in South Africa since the declaration of emergency last Saturday. I must say, however, that even before the formal and official declaration in the townships, that our people were experiencing a reign of terror. Okay, so we see the reference to the French Revolution, conducted by the South African Police and the South African Defence Force, that's the army, that was equivalent to a state of emergency. Even before Saturday, an unofficial curfew was in operation in our townships, and many of our people were shot and killed when they moved after dark. Even before the state of emergency, many people were detained without trial, arrested without cause, tortured in gaols, and shot like dogs on the streets of our nation. Even before Saturday, we knew of death squads that were roaming the streets and receiving uncommon protection from the police and the South African government. These are the well-known facts that disturb us about South Africa. In the last few months, a pattern is emerging that has persuaded us that all we are seeing is a systematic assassination at the middle-level leadership, not only in the UDF but other organizations. We do not know exactly who these people are, although we have raised critical questions about the disappearance and deaths of certain leaders in South Africa, which have not been answered satisfactorily by the South African government or by its police. And then you will have, so you will always have 3 written sources and 1 visual source. And that was a poster issued by the UDF on the 20th of August 1983 to encourage the masses to stand up to the apartheid regime. Okay? And if we look at the interpretation of the source, so we demand the SADF, so they wanted the army and the police out of the townships. Okay? UDF support the consumer boycott. So we see there the people coming together to push them out of the townships. Okay. And here we have a series of source-based questions. Now we are heading towards our break, so we are going to get to these questions after the break. Okay. So if I can ask teachers just to supervise that after the break, we're going to spend a few minutes where I want learners actually to actively answer these questions, okay? And I'm going to have you, for example, once you've answered a set of questions, type your questions into the chat box, and we then discuss those questions. And we're going to be identifying the levels of the questions, because that is important so we know how much information to give, okay? So it's going to be a little bit more interactive in the next session. We're going to be identifying the levels of the questions and then starting to answer those questions. We're not going to do all of them, obviously, because we also have to cover the essay question. So just for about 15 minutes, we're going to be going through, after the break, we're going to be going through the different source-based questions. Okay. So we are going to be having a 15-minute break now. So if everybody can please be back by 11 o'clock. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are back. Okay, if teachers, if any of your learners are still not back from the break, you could just let me know, and we'll just wait for everybody to settle down. Okay, so everyone was issued with the winter school booklet, which have these questions and the sources in it. And we're just going to work through answering just a few of those questions, just so that we can identify and see that we are answering those questions satisfactorily. Okay? So the first question is, what were the two main aims that Botha's reforms wanted to achieve? And the first question that I have for you is, if anyone can please identify for me what level that question is, because that is important for us to understand what level the question is so that we can know how much information to give for that question. So if anybody can just type into the chat box what level that particular question is. Very good, level 1. Okay, so it's asking you to directly extract from the source what were the two main aims that Botha's reforms wanted to achieve. And if we go back to the source, because we are busy with source 1a, okay, if we have a look at source 1a again, it was hoped that it would reduce international criticism of apartheid, satisfy white South Africans, form relations with other black countries in Africa, and reduce internal black resistance. So it gives you 4 answers, 4 possible answers that you can use over there. Okay? So when we go back to the question, 4 possible answers that we could use over there. But this question only asks for 2. So any 2 of those 4 answers are acceptable. Any 2, okay? Then the second question, explain the reasons behind the NP policy in passing the Black Local Authorities Act. Okay, and we go back to the source. Okay, if anybody can answer that question for me? Please. What level is that question? You just type into the chat box if you can identify the level. That is a level 2 question, correct? And who can answer that question? Okay, so we've identified that it's a level 2 question, and if we go back to the question, we see that it says, explain the reasons behind the NP policy in passing the Black Local Authorities Act. So what were their reasons for implementing it? Okay, so we have a look at paragraph 2 of this, okay, and find me the reasons. And it's a 2 times 2 question, which means we must have 2 points of explanation. Would anybody like to try to give me just one? Okay, so if we look at the source, we'll see the reasons it was introduced, okay, was to give the community councils some control over local affairs, okay, that would satisfy their political aspirations and meant that they wouldn't demand democratic rights at the national level. So it was hoping that by giving them a limited amount of control, that they wouldn't demand more rights. Okay? It was also introduced to create a richer black middle class, okay, that would be dependent on the apartheid government to keep their elevated positions, okay, which means that they would help reduce the amount of resistance against apartheid South Africa, because without apartheid South Africa, this new elite that would emerge, this new black middle class, wouldn't have their positions, wouldn't have the money that would come from those elevated positions as well. And then when we go down and we have a look at, for example, the level, a level 3 question, for example, okay. Consult sources 1C and 1D and explain how 1C supports source 1D. Now here I explained to you in our session earlier, I explained to you that over here you need to give two different points of comparison, okay? So looking at sources 1C and 1D, 1C as we can see is a written source, okay, and 1D is a visual source. So two ways in which they support each other. So when we look over here, okay, let's see, so, our people were experiencing a reign of terror conducted by the South African police and the South African Defence Force, and we can see in the image, for example, the army truck and the people, armed police or members of the army that were in the townships at that time, okay? Many people were shot like dogs in the streets of our nation. We can look there at, for example, the guns, the weapons that they have, okay? Okay, and then we can also say, we know the death squads were roaming our streets and receiving uncommon protection from the police and the South African government. And again, there we have a visual of, for example, law enforcement, whether that be the police or whether that be the army in the townships, okay, and they were armed. Okay, so remember that when we are looking at a level 3 question, a comparison question, we need to give two pieces of information, okay, so two different pieces of information that we need to expand on. But we are going to move now over to the second part of this session, which is preparing for the essay question on the Black consciousness movement. Okay? And what challenge Black consciousness posed to the apartheid state. So we go back to our PowerPoint again. if there's anybody that cannot see the PowerPoint, if you could please just let me know in the chat box so that we can sort that out. Okay, so what we are looking at in this section is answering the essay question, and the essay question, which can be phrased in various different ways, is going to focus on how the Black consciousness movement challenged the apartheid state. Okay, thank you, Justin. Alright, so in order to do this, the content that we're going to be looking at is content that you've studied with your teachers in class. The nature and aims of Black consciousness, the role played by Steve Biko, okay, his ideas and his writings and how that influenced people, the Black consciousness movement, what it was, the various organizations that emerged, the challenge posed by those ideas of Black consciousness to the state, how did it actually oppose the state, the 1976 Soweto Uprising, and again then briefly, okay, relating to the influence of the Black consciousness movement on the students, and then the legacy of Black consciousness on South African politics. Now, one important thing that I want you to note here, and this is a mistake that a lot of learners have been making with regard to the essays, is that they have a heavy reliance on this particular section here, the Soweto Uprising. I know teachers did focus on that in great detail, okay? But your essay is not about the Soweto Uprising, okay? So you cannot focus the entire essay on the Soweto Uprising. Even if you are given a question that states that the Soweto Uprising, right, the 1976 Soweto Uprising, proved that the Black consciousness movement was reigniting protest in South Africa. Alright? Even in a case where you get a question that directly refers to the Soweto Uprising is but one aspect in a number of ways in which the Black consciousness movement influenced or reignited the struggle in South Africa. Okay. So again here we're looking at overcoming the challenge of language, okay, understanding the key concepts that are used throughout the essay, finding the meanings of words that you don't understand, because if you truly understand the concepts and words, then you will be able to answer the question fully, okay. You'll be able to establish your introduction, have a good solid line of argument, and a conclusion. Alright, so the first thing we're looking at is the introduction, okay? So the introduction responds immediately to the question. This is where you must take a stance, okay? If it is an argumentative question, you are going to a greater or lesser extent, agree or disagree, okay? So the question might ask you, to what extent can this statement be validated, okay? You are going to say it can either be fully validated, partially validated, validated to a large extent, okay? Or it might ask you, do you agree with the statement? In which case, you need to agree or disagree with the statement, okay? You need to then explain in your introduction why you've chosen a particular standpoint. And then you need to identify how you will prove your answer. And I'd like to explain this by using the ACT method, okay? So firstly, A, answer the question, okay? Take a stance. Do you agree with the statement? C, contextualize, okay? Explain what you are going to be talking about. And T, make a thesis statement, okay? In other words, establish your line of argument, alright? For example, in this essay I am going to prove that, or this essay will prove that, okay? This essay will examine this in order to conclude that, okay? That's going to be your line of argument. So you're going to take a standpoint, you're going to take a stance, and then you are going to use the evidence in order to prove that. And you are going to feed back to that thesis statement consistently throughout your essay. And that's what makes a great essay, is having your line of argument at the end of every paragraph that feeds back to your thesis statement. So, the different types of essay questions that you can be asked, okay? So, type 1, it is the philosophy of black consciousness that restored pride and dignity of black South Africans and encouraged them to challenge the apartheid regime in the 1970s. Do you agree with the statement? Use relevant historical evidence to support your response. So, you are given a statement and you are asked whether you agree with the statement, okay? You need to take a stance, excuse me, state whether you agree or disagree, and you need to use historical evidence to support your stance, okay? I agree with the statement because, I disagree with the statement because, I partially agree with the statement because, okay? One way in which we can phrase that introduction is, one can agree that by the 1970s, the philosophy of black consciousness restored the pride and dignity of black South Africans. It was evident in the way black South Africans resisted the apartheid government, and this essay examines the impact of the black consciousness philosophy in restoring black pride to a point where people openly challenged the apartheid regime in the 1970s. So this introduction, okay, gives the reader, it tells the reader what stance you are taking, why you are taking that stance, and it gives an idea or an overview of some of the evidence that you are going to use in order to prove that, to prove why you are taking that stance. So, most essays address the questions around what, who, and when. Good essays address the questions around why and how. And the best essays address the questions around what was the impact and what was the results. Okay. The content plus your line of argument gives you the 100% score. If you look at your essay rubric, you will notice there are two sides to it. The left side going down and the top side going across. And each side of those, one side represents the content, that's the left side, and the other side represents the presentation. And presentation refers to your line of argument. How well did you argue your point using the evidence? You can have an essay that has the most brilliant content, okay? It has every bit of content that it needs in it. But if you have not linked that content to your argument, to your thesis statement, you are not going to achieve a good mark. Alright? So you need to have a line of argument that you are consistently referring back to. So the idea, it was the philosophy of black consciousness that restored pride and dignity of black South Africans, that's the impact or the effect, and encouraged them to challenge the apartheid regime in the 1970s, okay? So we're going to look at both of those within each of your paragraphs. How did it restore black pride and dignity? How did it encourage them to challenge the apartheid regime? So, a good essay with content and line of argument demonstrates a knowledge of aims, ideas, and philosophy of the black consciousness movement. That's the theory of the black consciousness movement. What was it? Why was it introduced? Analyze Biko's role within the movement. Okay? Paying particular attention to his ideas and writing, because his ideas and his writing had an impact. What did he say? What did he write that restored the pride and dignity of black South Africans? So we're looking at that idea of black people taking their liberation into their own hands, of not relying on white liberals for their freedom. So write about the impact of the black consciousness movement. Okay, how did it encourage black South Africans to challenge the apartheid regime? Okay, how did it call people to action? How did the ideas and actions of the black consciousness movement challenge the apartheid government? What was the impact? How did it pose a threat? The 1976 Soweto Uprising really, and keep it focused on how it relates to the influence of the black consciousness movement on the students. So how SASO, okay, influenced the formation of SASM, okay, how the teachers who had previously been members of SASO influenced the students who were members of SASM, okay. So the Soweto Uprising was an example of the application of the call to action of the black consciousness theory. And then you also need to look at the legacy of black consciousness on South African politics. What was the impact? What was the lasting impact of black consciousness that restored pride and dignity? There you look at how it reignited protests, how it resulted in the establishment of various other black consciousness organizations, okay? Reigniting, for example, worker strikes, trade unions, okay? How it reignited protests from the older generation. So the BPA, the Black Parents Association, that was formed in response to the Soweto Uprising. Then your conclusion, okay? It was the philosophy of black that restored black pride and dignity of South Africans, encouraged them to challenge the apartheid regime in the 1970s. So this is just a simple example of a conclusion. So in conclusion, by the 1970s, the philosophy of black consciousness restored the pride and dignity of black South Africans, and it was evident in the way black South Africans challenged the apartheid government. And then again, reflecting back on what you had done, this essay examined the impact of black consciousness philosophy in restoring black pride to a point where people openly challenged the apartheid regime in the 1970s. Okay, so some examples of questions that you might be asked, okay? Biko and the black consciousness movement was significant in South Africa's liberation struggle. Do you agree? Okay? Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. Over there, your first line is going to be either one can agree or disagree, okay? Or I agree with the statement. It's a simple, easy way to address that. Explain to what extent the black consciousness movement influenced the Soweto Uprising of 1976. Okay? Over there, your first line is going to focus on the black consciousness movement. Okay? Had a large impact or greatly influenced the Soweto Uprising of 1976. You might say it had a partial influence if you want to bring in the economic conditions of Soweto at that time. But most people will take the stance of having a large contribution. Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement played a significant role in influencing the Soweto Uprising in 1976. Critically discuss this statement. Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. Okay? Over there, you are going to say that he did play a significant role in influencing the Soweto Uprising in 1976. Okay. Now, just to counter just some of the gaps over there with regard to content. so what we're going to be looking at here is what the black consciousness movement was, okay? So the philosophy introduced by Steve Biko in 1968 when he was one of the founders of South Africa's first blacks-only student organization. Remember that you are going to mention there, for example, that there was the breakaway from oh, excuse me. That they broke away in order to form SASO, okay? So proponents of black consciousness were not anti-white, but they believed in setting up blacks-only organizations that were neither influenced by whites nor dependent on white liberals. They consciously embraced the term black in defiance of the apartheid state's use of the term non-white, because that term non-white had a feeling of being less than, whereas as asserting themselves as black, they were saying that I am something, I am someone, I am black, okay? And the term black also came to incorporate other people of color, so Indian and colored people were also recognized under that. It also challenged that philosophy of black consciousness, that idea of being black, also challenged the apartheid government in that it brought people together, it united people under one banner. It looked beyond race, it looked beyond ethnicity. No longer were people Xhosa or Zulu or Sotho or colored or Indian. People were all black. And the aims of apartheid was to separate people along both racial and ethnic lines. So even in its philosophy, even in its ideas, it challenged apartheid, because apartheid was about separation. So it advocated black self-respect and confidence in order to free black South Africans from a mindset of black inferiority and white superiority. And what was the mindset of the apartheid government? Was the idea of Baaskap, okay? The idea of the white madam and the black maid. The idea of black people being less than white people. The idea that black people could only be educated and up to a certain level. The idea that black people were not good enough for. And so it's that mindset that they sought to break, to make black people believe that they were worthy of something, that they were worthy of more. Black consciousness encouraged black people to take pride in black culture and an interest in black history. And that also challenged the apartheid government. Because the apartheid government was going with the idea, this Western culture, Western ideas, that you had to dress a certain way, and you had to speak a certain way, and you had to understand a certain language in order to be considered better. And so encouraging this pride in black culture, in a black identity, in black history, was important for people to realize their own importance in the world. Proponents of black consciousness wanted black people to nurture their black identity rather than to simply be assimilated into white culture. Okay? To say it's okay if I am not fluent in Afrikaans, I'm fluent in Xhosa. Okay? It is okay if I don't dress the same way. To take pride in their cultural heritage. The philosophy promoted black unity and wanted liberation for all blacks in South Africa. So that idea of black unity also once again challenges the apartheid government. So here we're getting ideas of how the philosophy of black consciousness challenged the apartheid government. And that is what you've got to link to your line of argument, okay? So even in itself, without doing anything physical, even the idea of black consciousness, the philosophy of black consciousness, challenged the apartheid state, okay? But it was neither a political movement nor part of the armed struggle, And instead, proponents of black consciousness aim to free black people psychologically from the results of an oppressive and racist system so that they would have the will to physically overthrow the apartheid regime. So it aimed to free people's minds. It aimed to make people see that they were better than they were made to feel. It aimed for people to see that they had the power within themselves to take back and to assert themselves. Okay? So when we go back to the origins of the black consciousness movement, so in the 60s and 70s, this new generation of black students, professionals, and community workers, and they came together and they shared this new black consciousness. Okay? It was a new black cultural identity that was proud, it was assertive, it was modern. It also had its influences, as we know, in other international movements that were happening. So we've got, for example, the civil rights movement in the USA, the Black Panther Party was an influence, etc. Okay? So it was a new black cultural identity. It was proud, it was assertive, it was modern, it was a new way of thinking. And by 1976, black consciousness became almost a way of life. Okay? It mobilized the youth in schools across South Africa. And those young people who played a role in 1976 in Soweto Uprising, they would then play a vital role in the revival of ANC in the years to come. Okay? So, in 1968, a group of black student leaders, including Biko as we know, broke away from NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, and they then formed SASO, okay, which was a black-only organization working for the liberation of blacks in South Africa. So on two levels, from the psychological oppression as well as from political oppression and exploitation, okay. And SASO was the first black consciousness organization to clearly express the nature and aims of black consciousness. So they stated that blacks needed to first fight for psychological liberation, to liberate their minds, okay? And in order to do that, they needed to break away from white organizations and form their own independent black organizations, because they needed to prove to themselves that they could do this by themselves, that their freedom wasn't handed to them by white people, that they took it back. Because there was a value in taking back your freedom. And they believed that black people needed to build up their own value systems, to see themselves as being defined by themselves and not being defined by other people. And that black people had power as a cohesive group, as a group that worked together. So, in 1971, SASO then organized a number of meetings with the black community, church, youth, and cultural organizations, and they tried to launch a united black consciousness movement. Okay? And so in 1971, the Black People's Convention was formed, and the literature and the journalism obviously flourished in that time, and Biko became the editor of the Black People's Convention Black Review, in which the movement's ideas were widely debated. There were some newspapers like the East London Daily Dispatch that had a column that Biko wrote. But the Black Conscious Movement didn't have the deep community roots of the ANC, okay? And so it failed, obviously, to mobilize mass support in black communities, because most of the members are obviously students and members of SASO, and that's why it's only after 76 that the true impact of black consciousness can really be seen when mass organizations start to mobilize, okay? The government at first, alright, were actually quite accepting of the black consciousness of the black consciousness movement, because they felt it was kind of in line with the movements of apartheid that encouraged, black people to be separate. But thereafter, they saw that black consciousness was actually acting against the homeland's policy. Okay, and it was then in 1977 that they actually banned 18 black consciousness media and church organizations, which included SASO, the BPC, and the SACC, which was the South African Council of Churches. And we know also that in August of that year, Biko was arrested and died after being tortured in prison. Okay? So, the Black Consciousness movement aimed for a liberation of the mind of young black South Africans. Okay? And Steve Biko, as we know, played an enormous role in that. Okay? And what he said was, it becomes clear that as long as blacks are suffering from an inferiority complex, a result of 300 years of deliberate oppression, denigration and derision, they will become useless co-architects of a normal society. Hence, what is necessary as a prelude to anything else that may come is a very strong grassroots build-up of black consciousness, such that blacks can learn to assert themselves and their rightful claim. Okay, and he published that in the SASO newsletter, Frank Talk. So Biko's activism actually grew enormously. Okay, I'm just going to skip through this because we won't have time to go through that, and your teachers have gone through this with you. And I just want to go down to this. Okay. So here we look at what was the Black Consciousness movement. Okay. Defining it. What did it mean? Okay. It was a South African movement that encouraged the psychological liberation of black people in order to prepare for the overthrow of the apartheid regime. It wasn't a way to take down the apartheid regime. It wasn't an actual political party that was actually fighting the apartheid regime. It was fighting the struggle against psychological oppression within black people themselves in South Africa. Okay, so that those people could have the power, could take the power within themselves in order to overthrow the apartheid regime. It was based on the Black Consciousness philosophy that was articulated by Biko and other members of SASO. And it first took root in South African universities. So in 1972 there was a widespread student strike at black universities when SASO member Ongopotse Tiro was expelled from the University of the North after making a political speech. Because SASO was an organization for university students, it did not incorporate other elements of the black population, so it was quite limited. And in 1972, SASO and the BCM played a key role in the establishment of the black community programs, which ran medical and educational centers that were not part of the public sector. So it provided programs, it provided things to the black communities that were funded by black people. Clinics that were staffed by black medical staff for black people, that were funded with the equipment, and everything was funded by black people. It didn't rely on white South Africa at all, and that is what was significant about it. It was proving to black people that they actually had the power within themselves to do for themselves. So also in 1972, SASO formed connection with the South African Students Movement, SASO, which had already been established by black school students in Soweto. And this connection was facilitated by Tiro, who was at that time SASO's permanent organizer and also a history teacher in Soweto in 1972. And the Black Consciousness Movement was aware of the great potential power of the trade unions, but it didn't gain the kind of support among workers that it did among students in the 1970s. Okay? So, the Black People's Convention, so at the end of 1972, the BPC was formed, and this was an umbrella body intended to include SASO members who were leaving university and also to link various groups countrywide who had similar views. Okay? Winnie Kware was the first president, and Ntuli Shezi the first deputy president, and Sats Cooper the first public relations officer, and Biko was a field worker for the BBC. But they experienced numerous losses, and in 1972 Shezi was pushed in front of a train by a white railway worker and died of his injuries. And in 1973, Mosebudi Mangena was imprisoned on Robben Island. Okay, so they had their fair share of hiccups as well. I just want to get to the umbrella. So the BBC was an umbrella body that brought together the various black consciousness organizations, okay, including SASO, including the Black Community Programs, the Black Allied Workers Union, so the South African Students Movement, the Union of Black Journalists, and the Black Parents Association. Okay, so it brought together all of those organizations under one body. Okay, and those are the key organizations in the Black Consciousness Movement. Just want to go back to okay, so SASO, the BCP, BAU, and SASM quickly became affiliated with the BBC, and they were joined by more like-minded organizations as these were formed. And other organizations emerged from the BBC's existing membership, such as the Union of Black Journalists, which was established by drum journalist Masana Kamalo in 1973. And they also secretly established communication with the ANC leadership in exile. They were very wary of black consciousness at first because it was not racially inclusive, but the ANC soon realized that it shared a common goal, okay, which was a democratic South Africa. And after Biko was banned in 1973, he had to be based at his home in King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape, and thus this became the center for the black consciousness movement. Now, what was the challenge that the black consciousness movement posed to the apartheid state? Okay. So because of its blacks-only membership, it was first seen as something positive by the apartheid government because they felt it fit in with the policy of separate development. But when the government realized that the movement rejected the homelands policy and the apartheid system, they started viewing it as a threat to their policy of separate development. And they realized that the black consciousness organizations were building the foundations of a left-wing revolutionary movement, and they took harsh action to suppress the black consciousness movement. Okay? So both Tito and Biko were murdered. Boss murdered Tito in 1974 by sending him a parcel bomb while he was in exile in Botswana, and Biko, as we know, died in detention in 1977. They also tried to squash the black consciousness movement through the banning of BCM publications, the expulsion of members from universities, the arrest, detention, prosecution, and imprisonment of leaders as well. But they continued to expand in the mid-1970s in spite of government repression, and had a big influence on the students who led the Soweto Uprising in 1976. And in 1977, the government banned 18 black consciousness organizations as well as CISA. And in addition, it banned the World newspaper, which was edited by Percy Boza, who had allowed the views of the black consciousness movement to be expressed. So now we're going to move into the impact and the influence of the black consciousness movement on the Soweto Uprising, okay, because that's one important aspect. It's only one. It's not the entire essay, okay, so we don't focus on it as being the entirety of the essay. So, the Bantu education gave black school children a rudimentary and inferior education using limited facilities and poorly trained teachers, and it prepared black South Africans for servitude and positions, unskilled labor positions. and it gave them enough education to be useful to the apartheid system, but not the kinds of critical skills that would help them challenge the regime. Okay? So it was thought that black students or black people only needed to be educated up to certain levels of servitude. And many black school children became demoralized and they dropped out of school at an early age, and even those that did not become frustrated at the lack of opportunities. SASM emerged in Soweto in 1971 among pupils who were seeking a form of representation that was denied to them in black schools, and the pupils involved demanded equality and voiced their grievances with Bantu education. Remember, they had influences from teachers who had been members of SASO as well. Now, what was also happening in the townships in Soweto was extreme levels of poverty. Okay? People were hungry, people were frustrated. Children were seeing their parents struggling and not able to make ends meet. And there were extreme levels of poverty in Soweto at the time. And this was frustrating to a number of students as well. So black consciousness had a huge influence because children even started questioning why their parents were not doing anything to change the system. So in 1972, SASO and the BPC, SASO in 1972 and the BPC in 1973 made contact with SASM, introducing black consciousness ideas to its leadership and treating SASM as a part of the Black Consciousness Network. SASO and the BPC held workshops for school students that encouraged critical thinking and political knowledge. Two of the things that the apartheid states did not want black students to have. Okay, concepts of critical thinking and political knowledge. SASM also spread ideas of black consciousness through Soweto high schools by holding discussions and publishing a newspaper called Thrust. And Tito, who taught at Soweto's Morris Isaacson High School in 1972, was an important connection between the black consciousness movement and SASM. And Tokia Sekwale was a member of SASM who matriculated in 1972 and in 1974 started to establish ANC cells within SASM as well. We now look at the implementation of Afrikaans, okay, as a catalyst for the protest that it ignited in 1976. So in 1975, the government announced that Afrikaans would become the medium of instruction for 3 academic subjects, mathematics, geography, and history in black schools. But teachers were not equipped for this, and many black people viewed Afrikaans as the language of the oppressor. But objections were ignored by the regime, and teachers were suspended or fired for non-compliance. So in response to this opposition, some students in Soweto decided to boycott classes. As support for the student boycotts grew, student leaders were arrested, imprisoned, and in some cases they were banned. And at a SASM conference in May 1976, Mukuna of the BPC gave a lecture on black consciousness and the issue of instruction in Afrikaans. Okay? So, the SASM activists played a key role in organizing those peaceful protest marches against instruction in Afrikaans. Okay? But we know that the state had a violent, intense reaction to the marches, and they turned a peaceful protest into a nationwide explosion of youth anger and frustration. The police then shot live rounds into the crowd of school children, killing hundreds of them. And students reacted by setting fire to schools and government buildings. Okay. So as the massacres continued over the weeks, workers began to organize stay-at-homes in support of community demands and in protest at the savage repression of the state. And by 1979, the struggles of the youth, the communities, and the workers in the factories were slowly coming together. And it was this 1976 Soweto Uprising which ultimately led to the formation of the Black Parents Association, when parents actually started seeing their children standing up for their rights and their children standing up against the apartheid government. So again, the Soweto Uprising is but one aspect, okay, in this essay topic, okay. What is also important is the legacy of black consciousness on South African politics, okay. So the legacy of black consciousness doesn't lie in the organizations it created, but it actually lies in the ideas that it generated, okay. The bannings and the detentions of 1977 meant the end of black consciousness as an open political movement in South Africa. But the anger, the defiance, and the symbols of black consciousness actually remained. And after 1977, the remaining black consciousness leaders were divided over what strategies to follow next. So a lot of them felt that black consciousness had actually fulfilled its purpose and that the best way to proceed in the struggle against apartheid was to re-establish links with the ANC structures, both in exile and those structures that were actually underground in South Africa at the time. So during the 1980s, and here is where it links to your source-based topics, many of the leaders that emerged in the UDF, the ANC and the trade unions were activists that had actually started within the black consciousness movement, okay? And that includes people like Lekota, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa. They all kind of started during that time. But not all of the black consciousness leaders were happy about the revival of the ANC and the non-racialism of the mass democratic movement of the 1980s, okay? And so in 1978, a group of black consciousness leaders formed the Azanian People's Organization, ZAPO, okay? And so very similar conflict to what happened between the ANC and the PAC during, with the Congress Alliance and the Freedom Charter. And by 1979, the state's violent repression against activists had kind of restored the appearance of calm, okay? But what had actually happened in reality is that they'd only pushed those activists underground. A lot of the students who had been involved in the Soweto Uprising, the student protests, actually had left the country to go and join MK. And so all of those forces of resistance were then starting to devise new strategies and new ways of fighting against the apartheid regime. And that is what it revived, okay? It revived people's drive to fight against the apartheid government, okay? And it's those ideas of black consciousness, that idea that we are worth something, the idea that we have power, that we can take back, that we can liberate ourselves. We don't have to wait for our freedom to be given to us. We don't have to wait for our country to be handed back to us. It was those ideas which ignited the struggles that emerged in the 1980s. So we're going to move back to the booklet that you were issued. And we are just going to go down to the essay question. Okay? So as you see in paper 2, there will be 3 essay questions. Okay? The one will be on the black consciousness movement, the one we've just gone through here. The second one will be on the negotiated settlement. Okay? And the third one on the end of the Cold War. We just scroll down to the okay. So your essay questions will be phrased in the following ways. A statement statement will be given, okay? Candidates will then be asked to take a stance. Do you agree with this statement, okay? Or critically discuss. So, give your verdict as to what extent a statement or findings within a piece of evidence are true, or to what extent you agree with them. Provide evidence taken from a wide range of sources which both agree with and contradict an argument. And come to a final conclusion basing your decision on what you judge to be the most important factors, and just justify how you have made your decision. And then another type of question is explain to what extent. Okay, to state a particular degree to which something is or is believed to be the case, and this type of question calls for a thorough assessment of the evidence that you are presenting. Alright, so it is very important that you read the essay question carefully in order to understand what the focus is. Underline the instruction verb, the question focus, and the direction given to the content focus and the time frames. You need to take note of the format of an essay, namely introduction, body, which is divided into several paragraphs, and conclusion. You must also remember that your essay must be written in chronological order, and that is the order in which the events unfolded. Don't jump from, for example, 1968 and then you suddenly jump to 1989 and then you are back to 1972. Present things in chronological order within your paragraphs. Your introduction must always directly respond to your essay question, okay? You are expected to take a stance and to use evidence to support your stance. And the body of your essay should use the evidence mentioned in your introduction to further elaborate your stance. Now, you all have a lot of information that was given to you in this booklet on the Black Consciousness movement, okay? Some of this you may have gotten a while ago from your teachers. But it basically covers all of what we just touched on today in a lot more detail. Okay. Okay. So basically within this essay, you are going to look at what each of these things were as well as how they challenged the apartheid state. So what was the philosophy of black consciousness? How did it challenge the apartheid state? Okay? How did the black consciousness movement view apartheid? How did that view challenge the apartheid state? What was the impact of the philosophy on workers and trade unions? How did that impact the apartheid state? Okay? How did the writings and ideas of Steve Biko influence or challenge the apartheid state? What was the impact on the students, on SASM, Soweto Uprising? How did that challenge the apartheid state? So each of these, you are not only looking at what these were, but within your paragraphs you are discussing how each of these actually challenged the apartheid state. And so we are going to do a little bit of a task now that I'm going to ask teachers to supervise for me, please, teachers that are there, okay? So the question is, discuss the role and influence or impact of the black consciousness movement in South Africa during the 1970s. Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. Okay? This is divided into several paragraphs. Paragraph 1, your introduction. Okay? Take a stance and outline your content. Make your thesis statement. Okay? Paragraphs 2 to 9. Okay? Black consciousness philosophy, how black consciousness viewed apartheid, the impact on trade unions, the role of Biko, impact on students, influence on political organizations, community organizations, the legacy of black consciousness, and the conclusion. So the task that I have for you now, and we're just going to take 10 minutes of our time because I want us to have a little bit of time for feedback before we finish off, okay, is I would like you to firstly write an introduction. Write an introduction for this topic, okay? And the second thing I would like you to do is to choose any one of these paragraphs, any one, and expand on some points for just one of those paragraphs. That's all. So I want you to write an introduction, the actual introduction that you would write to this particular essay topic, as well as to choose any one of the paragraphs 2 to 9 and just in point form write out that paragraph for me, please. And we'll just do just 10 minutes. It's 12:02, so at 12:17. No, 12, well, let's just make it till 15:15, okay? So we'll give it till 15:15. And then we'll have some feedback and we will finish off. Remember that when you are looking at that paragraph that you need to be using the Peel method, okay? Point, explanation, evidence, link, or line of argument, okay? And the teachers are there around you to help to assist you if you are stuck with anything. So just two things is to write out the introduction. It doesn't have to be a long, lengthy introduction. And to just in point form write out any one of those paragraphs that you are comfortable with. And if there are any questions, remember just to type them into the chat box. And I will answer those questions for you. Sure, do you not have, it should be in your booklet that you were given, but I will scroll up to the question. Okay, so it is 1:15, okay, and I hope that even if you didn't get to the part we were planning out a paragraph, that you at least worked through shaping an introduction, okay? So, when we are approaching a discursive essay like this, discuss the role and influence or impact of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa during the 1970s, okay, we need to, okay, state how impactful or how influential the Black consciousness movement was, okay? So you needed to have stated in that introduction that the Black consciousness movement had a large influence, or it had a significant influence or significant impact, okay, in South Africa at the time. You then are going, that's just the stance that you are taking. You then need to outline why you are taking that stance, okay? And you do that to explain some of the things that you are going to discuss, okay? So it had a large impact, okay? Because it revived resistance in South Africa, both in its philosophy, in its ideas, and in the various organizations that were formed. By encouraging psychological liberation of black people, it encouraged the formation of various organizations, black consciousness organizations, which aimed to help South Africans liberate themselves from oppression. Okay? So that's the impact and the influence that it had. And in doing so, and here's where you're coming with your thesis statement, in doing so, it challenged the apartheid state, and it led to the revival of anti-apartheid protests in South Africa, or it led to protests against apartheid being reignited. Okay, because remember there'd been a slump in those protests. And that's how it challenged apartheid, because the apartheid state had kind of beaten protest into almost submission. Okay, remember a lot of the leaders were in exile, or they'd moved underground. Anti-apartheid leaders had moved underground, or they were in exile. And so the black consciousness movement, and so because the leaders weren't there, people had no direction. And so protests kind of almost came to an end. And what the black consciousness movement did was, it made people realize that they had power in themselves. So it reignited that struggle for freedom in South Africa. Okay? Now, what is important when we're looking at the body of our essay is using that PEEL method. Point, explanation, evidence, link. Okay? Having a topic sentence that tells the reader what that paragraph is about. Having appropriate and relevant evidence. Explaining that evidence to the extent that it shows the reader that you understand how that evidence relates to the topic. And then linking that evidence. Your line of argument is that last sentence that links that evidence to the thesis statement that you made in your introduction. Okay? That shows that you are able to understand the significant role played by the black consciousness movement. So if we look at that first body paragraph, paragraph 2 on the black consciousness philosophy, you are looking there, for example, at a topic sentence which states that the ideas or the philosophy of black consciousness, okay, we go back to the introduction, where we are, or to the essay question, had a large influence on South African people, in that it helped encourage people to liberate themselves from that mindset of oppression. Okay? The body, the midsection is going to look at evidence that contributes to this. Okay? It's going to look at what was the philosophy of black consciousness and how, so that's your evidence, what, okay? And how did that philosophy, that idea of black power, that idea of black pride, how did that encourage people to liberate themselves, to say that I am good enough, I am beautiful, I have power, okay? You then need to link that information back to your induction, to your line of argument needs to carry it, okay? So it needs to say, thus the philosophy of black consciousness, which aims to unite people, which aims for people to break that psychological oppression, challenged the apartheid state in that people began to see themselves as being more than what the apartheid state made them believe that they were. So, very important, and this is something that you must practice, and your teachers, I'm sure, will help you with this, okay, is focusing that line of argument that helps to link the information in the paragraph back to your introduction, to the stance that you took in the introduction. That is what's going to get you that those presentation marks on the rubric, okay? The content part is easy. We can rattle off that content like it's nobody's business. But can you explain how that content proves what the stance that you were taking in the beginning in your introduction? And that is vital. And that is where a lot of candidates lose unnecessary marks in that presentation section of the rubric, is because they are unable to carry the line of argument throughout your essay. And that needs to be consistent throughout the essay. You can't just do it once in your introduction. Every paragraph, you need to have a sentence that links the information in that paragraph back to your thesis statement, back to your introduction, back to the stance that you took. Because without that line of argument, that is like going to court, presenting a case with evidence, okay, and not being able to say, let's say you are a defense attorney, and your client is being charged with breaking in somewhere, okay. You can have all the evidence in the world, but if you are not able to explain how that evidence proves that it goes, that it links back, okay? If you're not able to prove how that, to explain how that evidence proves that your client is not guilty, your client's going to go to jail, okay? So you can have the world's load of evidence. You can't walk into court and say, there's my evidence, Your Honor, okay? You decide for yourself whether my client is guilty or not, okay? You are going to have to make that argument and say, this evidence proves that my client is not guilty because. And that's what you've got to do with each and every bit of information that you get. Okay. So, if there are any last questions at this time about anything, is there anybody who wants to share anything? Or any last questions about your essay or even your source-based questions before we finish off? Okay, so it seems there are no questions, so I just want to say thank you all for joining me today for this lesson. And thank you to the teachers for being present with you. I know it is time out of your holiday and we do appreciate it. So thank you all. If you want, teachers want the PowerPoints that we used today, I will make them available to the curriculum advisor who will then forward it on to you so that you can use it for your revision next term. Okay, and thank you to all the students. I know it's cold today. And to all the teachers, I hope that you're all warm and can go back into your beds now. You're very welcome. Are my Mount View students there? See if any one of them can respond to me. Oh, awesome. Who's that? Is gift there? Oh, the whole of 12A is there. Okay. Everybody? Hello, 12B is there as well. I will be coming back for two lessons next term, eh? Just so that you know, just so that I can say goodbye. Abdullah, you will have to answer either 2 essays and 1 source-based, or 2 source-based and 1 essay. So you answer 3 questions in total. Okay? You look at what your strengths are. Only you will know what your strengths are. If you are better, for example, in essays, then try and answer 2 essays and 1 source-based. Some of us will have our strength in source-based, so we answer 2 source-based and 1 essay. Okay? But you'll have to answer a total of 3 questions, Abdullah. You're very welcome. Who's that reading so heavily?
Excellent, Anne.